Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Game Industry Legends interview series. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for video games at AWS. Today, I will be speaking with a true game industry legend, Steve Cartwright. Steve was one of the first 5 game designers at Activision, which was founded at the end of 1979 by game designers who left Atari and created the very first third-party game developer in the industry. Steve pioneered a variety of techniques and technologies that have become commonplace in video game development. His prolific career has found him creating one of the most complicated game kernels for an Atari 2600 game, Megamania, which is one of my top 10 games of all times. He developed the concept for the first video game sequel, the first game to shoot live actors against a green screen, producing the first online sports game, and so much more. Steve has made an outsized impact on the games industry across his 30 years in the industry, with more than 60 published games he has helped to create. It is my privilege to welcome to the program game industry legend, Steve Cartwright. Steve, welcome to the Game Industry Legends program.
Great to see you again.
Great to see you too, man. All right, so listen, what I love to do when we first start these conversations, I do these fast 5 questions. So if you'll indulge me, let's talk about your earliest days with computers and video games. So what was the first computer or video game system that you remember having in the home? Or, what is the first computer or video game system that you remember bringing into the home as an active part of your home setup?
Well, I grew up a long time ago before video games. So the first game system I had was the Atari 2600, and that's when I had to get one because I started working at Activision.
All right. And we're going to get into that too. So here's my other question for you, since you mentioned the 2600. Do you call it the 2600 or do you still call it the VCS?
Oh, boy. I don't remember. It was interchangeable back then.
For me, it's always VCS, and that is kind of an old man yelling at clouds sort of thing. When people bring up, oh, do you remember the 2600? I go, no, I remember the video computer system. But yeah, anyway, all right, so the 2600 was the first in your home. How about your first arcade game? Do you remember the first arcade game that you remember playing?
That must have been Asteroids or Pong, one of the two.
Yep. We didn't have that many in that era, right? So mine were right in there. Space Invaders was really the one that stuck out kind of in my mind,
Right.
just because it was just so different, right? But yeah, I remember experiencing Pong as well.
Or maybe it was Outlaw.
Oh,
It
yeah.
might have been Outlaw.
Now
Yeah.
was Outlaw an Atari game? Or was that a key game? Do you remember?
I think it was an Atari game.
Okay, yeah, because there's
Later
a
they did the home version of it.
right,
So,
yeah, because remember there was key games, right? Which
Right.
there was a whole story behind that, but that's not part of our questions, right? So we're narrowing it down to either Pong, Asteroids, which I believe that was. Oh my goodness, why am I blanking? It wasn't. Who was the guy that? Okay, I'll come back to that. Okay, so we know it's got to be Pong, Outlaw, or Asteroids. All right, third question. When did you start programming? Like, what was the first language that you remember programming in?
I mean, we took in college, this is really before computer science, we took a course in Fortran, I think, with the old punch cards. And so we had like a 6-week course on typing up punch cards, and then that's about it. The first time I really started programming was when I joined Activision.
Yeah. And of course, now on punch cards, right? The first lesson is don't drop them. Don't drop them, right? And if you weren't good about numbering them or keep them in sequence, that was it, right? Like you just, your program is gone. If you had to make sure your shoes are tied, make sure your friends aren't goofing with you, be careful carrying your stack.
Right.
Okay, and then fourth question, from your earliest games that you remember playing, which ones or one do you think had the biggest impact on you? Like one that you can revisit to this day, or one that kind of shaped the way you thought about games and game development?
Boy, well, I think probably the biggest hit I had was called Megamania, which you have mentioned in the past. That was heavily inspired by an arcade game called Astro Blaster.
Mm-hmm.
So that probably had a big impact on me. I just thought it was pure fun, pure mindless fun.
Yeah.
You shoot everything.
And we are going to talk about that game because there is a bit of history there with me in that game. And then the fifth question is, who would you say is the most influential programmer or designer or industry figure that kind of shaped you or influenced you, or that you just kind of admired their work and kind of can go back to year over year?
Well, I mean, that would have to be David Crane, who was the founder of Activision, the guy I went to college with, who brought me into Activision.
Yeah.
They basically taught me how to program on the 2600.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you for those fast 5 questions. Now, what I also want to do is say, I want to explain to our audience how we got connected here. So I'm sitting here at AWS one day and Slack pops up and a message pops up from this guy, Steve, and says, "Oh, hey, man, I didn't know you worked here." And I was like, well, yeah, I work here. What the hell are you doing working? Like, where are you working? How? So the reason that really threw me back was the last time we had spoken was actually when I had interviewed you. Well, maybe not the last time, but I had interviewed you for the Art of Video Games exhibition that we did at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Right. And I remember that the day, very well. I remember I had to sleep in the middle of this film, set that we set up in one of the suites at the Intercontinental, right, which was my room. The hotel was not very happy with us because we just stacked all their furniture in the corner and we turned the whole thing into a studio shoot. But yeah, just so surprising that you were in here and it wasn't around games. We're going to talk about the work that you're doing here and how you came into AWS. But after realizing that you were here, I just started going around to our colleagues going, do you understand, that Steve is here? Do you know his background? Some were like, oh, yeah, I kind of knew. Others were like, not. I'm like, okay, well, we need to correct this right away. And that's why we had the conversation about having you on here, because the work that you had done at Activision and really impacted me. Right. And we're going to talk about that. So I was thrilled that you reached out to me. I'm so happy that you're here working with us as well. And with that, we're going to dig into your career. So let's talk about the road into Activision. For those that don't know how Activision got started, Steve, maybe you want to go ahead and explain to our audience how Activision got formed and why.
Sure. Well, I had gone to school with a guy named David Crane, and we actually paid our way through college as professional foosball players.
Oh,
but that's a whole other story. But, after we graduated, we both worked at National Semiconductor, making chips. And back then, everybody played tennis. This is before Tiger Woods had made golf cool. And probably before Tiger had even been born, but. Everybody played tennis. John McEnroe, Connors, Jimmy Connors, Bjorn Borg. Those were the guys on the cereal boxes doing TV commercials. Dave was especially good at tennis. He had a doubles partner named Al Miller, who worked at a little startup called Atari, making arcade games. And Al had a problem. His most prolific creative designer was also kind of a jerk. Nobody could get along with him. Very bossy, very demanding. Mm-hmm. Also, back then, games were not programmed. Games were built out of physical components, physical chips on a circuit board. What Al found out was this creative guy that nobody could get along with also wasn't actually doing the games. He was paying his buddy under the table to make the games for him.
Oh. So
Al fires him, hires his friend Dave, and they start working at Atari. And they create a couple games, and then a year later, Atari starts working on a secret project, the world's first home computer, the Atari 400. And Al had hired a young teenage whiz kid to do the operating system for him. And after a year, this teenage whiz kid delivered absolutely nothing. Turns out he'd been working for somebody else on the side doing their operating system. So So Al's having bad luck with people. So anyway, he fires this teenage programming whiz kid. He and Dave worked 24/7 to do the operating system for the Atari 400. Time to get it out for Christmas. Well, after that, they said, we've had enough of Atari. This is too much work, too little pay, no recognition. So they said, let's start our own company. So he and Dave and Al and two other designers quit, started their own company. And we said, well, what are we going to do? He said, well, we're not quite sure, but until we figure it out, let's make some video games. And that company was Activision, the world's first third-party software developer.
That's right.
Just think about it. Before then, the only people that made software were the companies that also made the hardware.
Yeah.
So Activision went from 0 to 6 million sales in 6 months. And that might not sound like a lot, but back then, that was the biggest success story in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
6 million in 6 months. And then they said, we need to hire more designers. And then Dave said, well, I got this friend from school, Steve, let's hire him. And so that's how I got into the games business.
All right. Okay.
The funny part of the story, the guy that Al had to fire, the really creative guy that nobody could get along with, that was obviously Steve Jobs.
Yep.
And the guy he was paying under the table to do the games for him, well, that was Wozniak.
Yep.
And later, the teenage whiz kid that never delivered the operating system, that was a young Bill Gates.
Amazing. Okay. Oh. All right. Okay. So before we jump into that nugget of amazing information, we should also mention, so I want to go back and mention, so for Asteroids, so it was Ed Logg, right, was the one that actually built it. And what you're talking about, like Activision at that time, these were discrete circuits. So all the audio that you hear, there were no sound chips or anything like that. These are discrete analog circuits that had to be created, right, on the board using parts. So, it's wonderful to go back and look at old system boards from that era because you can literally see the logic of the game laid out, right, on the board, right? And if you do kind of path traces on the board, you can see that stuff there. So right, the 2600 was really the first. Well, it wasn't the first fully programmed like that. Was Fairchild Channel F, of course, but the 2600 was the one that was the most malleable, had the biggest impact and market and all of those things. Okay, so that's the analog story. The other piece of the Activision story, and please let me know if this is true, right? Being in game preservation, it's important we get these stories right. The other impetus for founding Activision was the fact that the company at Atari was making all of this money on the back of the designers, and the designers weren't getting any credit, right, for not even just being able to put their names on the product or in the manuals to be able to point to this work, let alone being paid, right, to do this. And so you guys just got fed up and were like, okay, you know what? It's time to go and make our own fortune. Let people know that we're the ones making this stuff, right? And really set forth the idea of game designers, right? And that's true.
Yeah, they had gone into, by that time, Nolan Bushnell had sold Atari to Warner Communications, I believe, and the new CEO was Ray Kazar.
Yeah.
And a bunch of designers went in to raise office and said, look, you guys are making millions and millions and millions of dollars off our work. And we're getting paid such a small amount. It wasn't even about recognition then. It was just the pay was.
Yeah.
And he said, so what are you talking about? You guys are no more important than the people on the assembly line putting the cartridges together.
Yeah.
And they looked at each other and said, remember, there was a whole thing about they had T-shirts printed up saying we're just a bunch of high-strung prima donnas.
Yes.
And all that was true. And that was really the impetus to say, we've had it with this way. We're going to start our own.
What I love it when you bring up that quote. So our good friends over at Digital Eclipse, who was just acquired by Atari, right? So we're coming full circle now, 50 years later, right? They had done the Atari 50th collection, and as a promotion, they had those T-shirts reprinted that said, just another high-strung prima donna. And they were giving them out at conferences, and I have one at home. So I'm glad to, not an original, but I'm glad to have had, a little bit of that. Now, the other piece too around the Steve Jobs and Wozniak thing, there was always this discussion around the Apple I coming out and where did those chips come from? Probably pilfered off assembly line, right at Atari. But I also, I remember Nolan Bushnell, right, the co-founder of Atari, had told me the story about how, Mr. Jobs was a fruitarian at that time, thought he wouldn't smell if he just ate fruit and everything. And the guy reeked terribly. He was telling everybody what to do. So they moved him to an evening assembly line with fewer people there. And then he was going on, a pilgrimage or a retreat. And so they said, okay, we're going to pay you and going to fly you into Germany and you'll service like these boards in, basically for us to pay your way right overseas, and that's kind of started that whole trip, right? But what I love, right, is Atari was this nucleus of innovation and technology inspiration in the Valley at that time. And I will tell you that being at Sun Microsystems for 16 years, I had done an interview with John Gage, who was the chief science officer there for a program I used to do when I was at Sun. And he said, there was this company in the Valley at the time we were starting Sun called Atari. And they were the fastest growing, company. So we're like, how do we apply those sort of same, that same velocity to the computer industry and what we want to build? So Atari just had a massive impact, in just about every, sector within the tech space during its time. But Activision is the one that proved that you could create viable third-party content for these established systems and build a business on top of it. Had you all not done that, we don't know what kind of would have happened, right? Somebody may have done it because we know Rob Folt went off to create a Magic and stuff like that, right? But that was on the back of you all leaving to found Activision. So kudos to you all for having the gumption, the foresight to go ahead and do it.
It was a different time.
It was a different time. All right, so let's talk about your time there. So you're one of the 5 original Activision game designers, and you've published more than 60 games across your entire career. And, there was a conversation that was going on internally on Slack around one of your first games. I believe it was your first game, Barnstorming, right? So you said you had a story around this, and it was the first game to use the Activision sunset. So tell us that story, and how did Barnstorming kind of come into being?
Sure. So the first day at Activision, when the guys had quit Atari and started Activision, Atari immediately sued them for every reason they could think of. One of the things named in the lawsuit was something called the Venetian blind effect. That's where you would display graphics on every other scan line of a TV. Back TVs didn't have pixels, then they had scan lines. But Activision never actually used the Venetian blind effect. But as a joke, Dave had made up a screen on his TV that was just a window covered by a Venetian blind. And you pulled the joystick, and the Venetian blind would raise up, and it would display a beautiful pasture in the distance with the sunset. And they did it totally as a joke.
Right.
And then I looked at that and I said, oh, what a pretty scene. Great to incorporate a scene like that in a game. But David just done it just for fun. On the way home from work, my very first day, now this is back way before the internet, and companies would often hire airplanes to pull advertising banners behind them. Yeah. And as I'm driving home, I see a biplane in the sky pulling an advertising banner. And I looked at it and I said, the whole game came to me in like 2 seconds. I go, that's it. Barnstorming, flying a plane through barns over windmills. And I'll incorporate the beautiful sunset in the background. So it was really, the game took about 2 seconds to design. And that was it.
That reminds, so the Venetian blind things, right? This is a long, standing history of the people that legislate or write laws don't understand technology, right, when they're faced with it, right? And so you could do things like, oh yeah, the Venetia blinds, just like this. No, what we really meant is the way we're actually racing the beam right down the screen and drawing these lines and removing stuff from the screen. Maybe you can actually tell us about that technique, how you were able to get such detailed graphics onto the screen when there really wasn't enough memory to actually do that in the type of games that you were programming at the time.
Well, right. There was, I think, 4K of memory. Well, the first games only had 2K, so maybe 128 bytes of RAM. Unlike today, where if you want to put an object on the screen, you specify its X and Y coordinates. Back then, we knew that the electron beam had to go across the screen from left to right, from right to left, left to right. And it took 76 processor clock cycles to go across the screen. And the processor 6502 was running at about 1 megahertz. 76 clock cycles to go across the screen. So if I wanted to position an object dead center of the screen, I had to set up a little software loop that counted, what's half of 76? 38 clock cycles. I had to set up a little software loop that counted 38 clock cycles. And when it reached 38, I'd store the graphics to the hardware register. That's why it appeared halfway across the screen. And in terms of vertically, TV has scan lines. I think there's about 200 scan lines. And so if I wanted it to appear again in the middle of the screen on line 200, I had to set up another little loop that counted scan lines till it got to 100. And then that's when I turned on the code that waited 38 clock cycles to display the object. So it literally took months to create a display of a game. I mean, Barnstorming probably took 2 or 3 months just to make that display.
Yeah.
Now you could do it, using Unity, or you could do it in about 5 minutes. But,
yeah. But when we were, at the beginning of the conversation here, we talked about, earliest arcade games having discrete analog circuitry. These games, it just really dawned on me that you were still manipulating an analog display digitally to do things that the system really wasn't designed to do. You're literally hitting the beam, right, the scan line at a certain point, clearing stuff out of memory, loading in the next part of it to paint the bottom of the screen, when now, in effect, the top part of the screen no longer exists in memory. It's persistent on the screen because it's been painted, and the TV, the CRT, just hadn't gone and filled in all of the lines to go ahead and blank the screen at, 60 fields, right? 29.5, then 29.5, right? I mean, that's insanity. Right? It's just absolutely crazy.
I remember one day talking to Dave at work saying, if people only knew how hard it was to do what we're doing. I mean, it took months and months just to create a display on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love when you talked about, driving home. So you had the sunset, in your head with regard to the Venetian blind stuff, and then seeing the plane. Reminds me of David Crane, spending 1,000 hours getting a Running Man, but then seeing Indiana Jones and going, oh, well, of course, he's running in a jungle and he's going to be collecting treasure. Like, it only took, seeing that movie for the genesis of those things. All right. So your second game, one of my top 10 desert island games. Oh, my God. Megamania. So you said that this was the most complicated screen kernel ever done on the VCS. So again, first, thank you so much for creating this game. It is still to this day blisteringly difficult. And my buddy Mike and I had a conversation because I think there were some versions of Megamania where when you fired your missile, it would move with the ship, and then others you would fire it and it wouldn't move with the ship. And I know that was a selection that you could do on the VCS, but I think it was standard on like the 5200 or something. So we had gotten to this argument. Of course, my memory failed me. Mike was right. But talk about Megamania and tell us why it's the most complicated screen kernel ever done.
Well, I mentioned it was heavily influenced by a game called Astro Blaster from the arcade. The kernel, which was the part of the code that created the graphics on screen, was complicated because you had objects moving side to side. You had the same objects scrolling up and down. You had missiles passing through those scan line graphics, and they're shooting missiles down at you. So it's just the combination of objects moving through each other, past each other, around each other. That's what took all the time. And once I got the display working, then it was how you make it playable. Hmm. And of course, back then, typically what you would do is if you completed level 1, level 2 would be a little bit harder, and then level 3 would be a little bit harder. So that's what I initially did. And by the 4th or 5th level, the game was just too hard. So I tried to back off on the increase in difficulty. Then the game was too easy. So I couldn't come up with a nice balance. So I came up with something where I would increase the difficulty over 2 or 3 levels and then drop the difficulty back down and give you a little bit of a break. I called it the sawtooth effect. So the difficulty increased like a sawtooth. It would go up in difficulty, then drop back down. It would go up a little bit and drop back down. It gave the illusion that, well, first of all, it gave the player a break every 4 or 5 levels. Mm-hmm. It also gave the illusion that you were getting better at the game because you thought, oh, I've mastered it. I'm getting right. And you think back on it, I mean, that's the technique that all the movies, music, this idea of tension and release. Yeah. You're building up an amount of tension, then you release it. You give the player a break. You give the listener, the movie watcher, a little bit of break. I was kind of doing it subconsciously, but I guess that's why it worked. And that's why it was so playable, because of that tension and release difficulty ring that I built in.
Yes, I mean, so even in this rudimentary state of games, right, there is the design loop, right, that comes into this, and understanding how to go ahead and create, like you said, that tension and release with minimal graphics, with minimal explanation, right? But completely evident in the design of the games. You know, we often go back and say we lacked the ability to fully describe what we wanted to impart to the player, which is, you know, in the hardware of its time, which is why these games came with these beautifully illustrated covers, with these lusciously, detailed manuals and things like to tell the story. So when you saw the space hamburgers up there, you knew what they were, right? Because you couldn't paint it on a VCS.
Well, that's another part of the story. When we finished the game, we realized we had something special. This was really fun. And then, okay, now comes the marketing. What do we call it? And at that time, the market was actually flooded with space games. I mean, there was Astro this, Astro that, Laser this, Laser that. And at one point, we even joked, let's just put it in a plain white box with big black letters that space game.
Yeah, you could swap it out for milk or juice if you needed to.
Right. And then a guy named Tom Lopez, who was manager of the design lab, probably the industry's first producer, came in one day and goes, I got it. We'll call it Gadzooks. Oh. And we go, you know what? That's not quite right, but you're onto something. Take it in a completely different direction. Take it away from space.
Right.
So they came back a week later, Megamania, a space nightmare. With the whole story that spaceship pilot falling asleep at the controls after eating a large pepperoni pizza, and you have this nightmare of all these food items, spinning hamburgers and French fries, and attacking you in the form of alien spaceships. And so that's how it got its name.
Yeah, amazing. And for those of you that haven't tried it, you should definitely go ahead and try to source a copy of it. In fact, I may just go ahead and play through that on a rewind episode that we do every Friday, because it is worth exploring. All right, we have a lot to get through. And so I'm going to push forward through your career. So you did a reskin of an existing game, Sequest, right, which was underwater Defender. But your follow-on game to Sequest, so your Barnstorming, Megamania Sequest, was a sequel. And we hadn't really seen sequels at this time in the games industry. And that was for Pitfall 2. Right.
Well, so we went, this was, I think we'd gone to CES. This is before E3, for the Electronics Games Expos.
Right.
Companies went to CES, Consumer Electronics Shows, in Chicago. And one night we went out to a movie. I think it was either Return of the Jedi or The Empire Strikes Back, one of those two. Anyway, we came back to the office the following week, and I couldn't really think of anything to do. I had no new game ideas. Dave didn't have any new game ideas. And I said, I got it. Pitfall 2. Because Pitfall had been our biggest. I said, Pitfall 2. And Dave looks at me and goes, you can't sequel a video game. What are we going to do? Have more jungle? No, we've got to move on to something new. I go, no, look at all these movies. I go, by that time we're up to Rocky 3 or, several Star Wars sequels. I go, look, Pitfall 2, this time he's not in the jungle, he's in underground caverns. It'll be great. And Dave, no, not going to do it. So I put together a display. Again, worked a couple of months to put together the display you see for Pitfall 2. He looks at it and he says, I think there's something there. And so then Jim Levy, the CEO of Activision, came in and said, Steve, I know this is great, but Dave was a designer of Pitfall. You've got to turn this idea over to him and let him finish it. Because games were marketed, but as coming from a certain designer back then.
Right.
So Dave took it on, and to his credit, he was also, like I said, he was a genius. He developed a new type of chip that had actually more memory in it.
Right.
And then he designed a sound chip. We'd come from National Semiconductor, so we knew how to design integrated circuits. So he designed a whole new integrated circuit for that game.
Yeah, and it was one of the few in the Atari VCS, the Atari 2600 era, that actually used these secondary chips. And it was a practice that we would see game companies use well into, the 8-bit generation with the NES, the Super FX processor for the SNES, right? So the idea that you could augment the power of that base machine just by adding more hardware to it.
Right.
I do know one of the games, one of my favorite games on the original Atari was called Tunnel Runner by CBS, which also required additional RAM and additional processing to be able to do these random mazes. And it was absolutely terrifying playing it as a kid. Going back and even revisiting it now, it still makes you jump a little bit. But so not only did you have this technological breakthrough that you were then implementing, but you were also fleshing out the world in which Pitfall Harry existed, right? So you had Quick Claw, the cat, and you had his niece, I think, Rhonda, that you had to go ahead and find. And that also then became part of the world of the Pitfall cartoons and the kind of the Pitfall canon, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, so that inspiration, that jump forward, created a much bigger world in which Pitfall Harry existed, and one that still is part of that canon today. And as I mentioned before, our good friends over at Digital Eclipse, Mike Micah, it is his go-to game on the Atari 800, because I believe when you finish it on the Atari 800, like a whole other game basically opens up, right? A whole other set of levels or something like that. So
yeah, I think he actually embedded the original Pitfall somewhere inside.
Yep.
Right.
Amazing. All right, so you have you have Pitfall 2 under your belt. Then you have what you said is one of the first team projects. Most of the games that you built at that time were single, driven by a single person, and that was Aliens for the Commodore 64.
Right.
Correct.
We'd gone out to see we went out to a lunch, took all the guys in the lab out to the movies one afternoon and saw Aliens. The blockbuster movie. We came back and said, man, so many action sequences, that would make a fantastic game. So our marketing department contacted the studio and said, we'd like to make a game, this movie. They said, okay, but it's got to be done in 6 weeks. So we said, I got it. We'll take all the action sequences in the movie and create little mini games for each of them. And then it'll take like 5 designers to do it. Create all these mini games and piece them all together into one cohesive product. And that turned out to be, so that's how Aliens came about.
Incredible.
That was on the Commodore 64. So every time we finished a game, it would have to go out to the disk to load the next game. And so we put up a digitized scene from the movie with real movie dialogue. To function as, so you could read some movie dialogue while you're waiting for the next game to load.
Oh, so basically, so you were masking load times under dialogue, right? Exactly. Right. Anything, look, so long as it's right from the player's perspective, right? We'll trick them any way we can to mask those things, right? Amazing. All right, so now Let's talk about another game, very fondly remembered. I fondly remembered playing this. It was Less Manley, Search for the King in 1990. Now, this was an adventure game done very much in the Sierra type of adventure mold, right, which was extremely popular at the time. And companies, from Lucas Film Games and Maniac Mansion and Day of the Tentacle, right, Secret of Monkey Island, we're kind of all doing this. We had Leisure Suit Larry series that were leaning into this. But you said that this game was developed using a graphical scene editor, something kind of the precursor to Adobe Flash. So tell us a bit about that game and about the tooling that you were using at the time to create this awesome adventure game.
Yeah, I mean, I love the games like Leisure Suit Larry and then King's Quest, obviously from Sierra Online. And I thought, why don't we make a parody of King's Quest? We'll call it Search for the King. But in this case, the king was actually the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley,
right,
back at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we need a character, kind of a computer nerd character. And there had been a show on TV called WKRP in Cincinnati.
That's right. I'm living on the air in Cincinnati.
Right. And one of the reporters' names was Les Nessman.
That's right.
And I said, oh, we'll call this guy Less Manley.
I'm sorry, you got to stop for a second. We're here just past Thanksgiving. Do you remember the turkey drop episode? Right. they put all the frozen turkeys out of the plane dropping on people. Yes. Right. All right. So Less Manley.
So what a great name, Less Manley. So kind of a nerdy computer guy who tries to impress a girl at the company he works in. He's an IT guy, and he wants to impress the boss's secretary. So he enters this contest. A radio station holds a contest, Search for the King. If you find Elvis, you'll win $1 million. Well, of course, Elvis was dead. But back then, there was all kinds of rumors. Is he really dead? Or is he alive? Anyway, so Les goes on this search for the king, Elvis. And of course, in the end, he does find the king because, remember, the object of those games was to not die. But in this case, the object of the game was to die at some point. You go up to heaven and you meet Elvis.
Right.
And then you come back and you have proof that you met Elvis. And that's how he wins the $1 million. But we knew that Sierra Online built their games by using some kind of scripting language. Mm-hmm. And I said, I want to take a different approach. I want to create something called a scene editor. So we spent actually about 6 months on a tool first. And it was a tool with drop-down menus. You say, click on the drop-down menu and say, a background. You type in a background, an image name, circus.jpg, circus.png. And that was the background image. And then you another drop-down menu and creating sprites. Okay, there's my less object, Less Manley object. And then you'd specify an animation sequence. And then there was a section you could write some code to manipulate the objects you had created using this tool. And years later, when I started prototyping in Flash, I go, this is basically exactly the tool that we had developed, 10 years earlier. And so
amazing.
It's kind of a funny coincidence. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, at the time, we also had things like Hypercard that came in, and that's what, the manhole, and that's what Cyan used, right, to do Mist and those sorts of things, right? And for those that don't know what, kind of that technology framework looks like, and we use it today really for web pages and browsing, right? Deep nested links and linking to other pages and being able to pop them in and out and basically creating these stacks of images with hotspots on them that trigger animations in the scene, that trigger, movement of other pages in and out of the frame. So just incredibly forward thinking and a way to go ahead and cut down time in development and be able to deliver these. So I loved Search of the King. And again, for me, one of the things I love about talking to my friends, right, in the games industry is it just invokes all these memories I had of playing through the games that you created too, that inspired me, right? And to discover more and more layers of this is just infinitely awesome for me. So thanks for bearing with me on that. All right, so we have a lot more to get through before we get to some Q&A here. I want to move on to a game that you had done called Lost in LA. And this was the first game that actually used live actors against a green screen, much like the one that I have here, right, in studio. So I mean, nobody had done this before. You keep breaking all of these rules, right? You keep breaking all these technologies that we have, or bringing them into the world. Tell us about what it was like to.
Well, I think that's when weathermen on TV started standing in front of a map projected on a green screen.
Right.
I go, oh, why don't we do that for a game? Well, instead of before that, all the characters in the game were hand drawn, 8-bit graphics. We said, why don't we photograph real people, live actors and models in front of a green screen, and we'll get an artist to paint the backgrounds using oil paints, just like they do in the movies, and we'll superimpose the characters on top of the backgrounds. And so, for a green screen, basically, I had an old green blanket in my home. We tacked it up on a conference room wall. You couldn't go out and buy a green screen back then.
Right.
I brought in some floor lamps from my house, and that was our lighting. Then, of course, we had about a dozen characters we needed to cast for the game. So, I mean, the script was written, we had it all storyboarded out, but we needed to find actors and models that matched the characters we wanted. So, I mean, where do you find actors and models? We didn't know, a bunch of computer guys, right? But before the internet, you couldn't search for them. So we got out a phone book. We looked through the phone book and we found a company called San Francisco Modeling Guild. We go, that's it. So we called the guy up. We said, we need to hire about a dozen actors and models for this game we're doing. And he said, okay, well, what you do is I'll send you a binder full of their pictures, and you pick out the ones you want, and we'll arrange for them to come down. And it's okay, great. So, of course, I think this might have even been before FedEx. So we had to wait in the mail, check the mailbox every day to see if this binder full of pictures had arrived. So finally, we get the album. We're anticipating, well, great, now we can pick out some actors. So we open up the album, and there on page 1 is a picture of a middle-aged man dressed like Robin Hood, except he's not wearing pants. And we realized San Francisco Modeling Guild provided figure models for drawing classes.
Oh my goodness.
not the kind of models we were after.
Oh my goodness, that's hysterical.
So, so we sent it back. So thanks, but no thanks.
Now you got people that are going to be searching for Lost in LA right now. Like, what was this game?
Right. So we eventually we contacted our marketing guy, and he connected us with the company that provided actual models. But a lot of the people we used were from around the building that we worked in. We went to a local gym and found a couple people that posed. And so a lot of the people in the game we actually knew were friends of ours.
Yeah, and that's, again, we're talking about the formation of this industry. That's what it took. And we even saw that, with like one of the ones that's popping in. Well, Mortal Kombat, right? It's those guys just getting their friends to dress up in costumes. Way of the Warrior by Naughty Dog, same thing. It's like we're shooting, our friends in the hallway here with dime store costumes, right? To just kind of make this stuff work, right? Because you were, again, creating the process, the technology, the procedure for these types of games, these types of experience to be delivered. Nobody had done it before. So it's all, well, what do we need? We need some models. Let's just go find some models. Like, we don't know what we're going to be able to pay you. We don't even know if it's going to work. So, let's get you in here and do it. I love that. And we still see that today, I think, in the indie space and in the bedroom coder space, right? Which it's by hook or by crook, let's just go get it done.
Yeah, I think we ended up paying the models maybe $25 an hour. And I think the budget for the whole video portion of the game was probably less than $1,000. So
Amazing. Amazing. All right, so let's move on to another set of firsts that you've done. So, for the first casual sports game, which was PGA Pro Tour in 1998, you went ahead and created the on-screen graphical interface that is still
right.
used right in those types of games today. But its follow-on, and actually that was for PGA Tour 486, in 94. The follow-on to that was EA's very first online sports game, which was PGA Tour Pro from 1998. Again, you are breaking down these barriers and creating new modalities of interaction. Like, tell us about how you landed on the UI and what was it like launching the very first online sports game for EA?
Sure. Well, when I joined EA Sports obviously was known for sports games, Madden football.
Yeah, EA Sports, it's in the game, right?
Right. But EA had the world's worst golf game. And the leader of the pack was a game called Lynx.
Lynx 386.
386.
Yeah.
And so they said, Steve, can you take over this golf team? I said, I don't even play golf. They said, it doesn't matter. We're contractually obligated by the PGA Tour to ship one more game, then we're done. We can't, this game, we can't sell this game. We're getting out of the golf business. We're going to shut down the franchise and lay off the team. And I said, but Gina, hear me. I don't play golf. I said, it doesn't matter. Just get the game out the door. So I played Lynx 386, which was harder to play than real golf, by the way. And the game was designed by hardcore golfers for hardcore golfers. I mean, it was a hardcore golf simulation.
Yeah.
And I said, what's fun about this? The crossover between hardcore golfers and video game enthusiasts was, the market was this big.
Right.
So I said, what if I could make a fun game that happened to be golf? Wouldn't the market for that be bigger than targeting hardcore golfers? So first of all, I started taking golf lessons. Then I went out and bought a book called Jack Nicklaus Teaches Golf. Before Tiger Woods. And the book was full of cartoon-like illustrations. One showed a big arc around the golfer, showing the path of the club. One showed a big arc through the sky, and visualized the flight of the ball. There was another illustration of a big bullseye on the green. I said, ooh, looking at these pictures, I think I understand golf. Well, why don't I put these elements into the UI, and I'll make it easier for people who are not golfers to understand what's going on. So that became the world's first in-game UI.
All right, so you've heard it here, folks. The swing arc that you see in games created right here by Steve Cartwright, and we're still using it today as the greatest way to look at speed and position and backswing of the club. It still works to this day. Incredibly inspired design.
Yeah, so when we finished the game, back then, each game was its own franchise. There was the golf franchise, there was the football franchise, and EA was the publisher.
Yeah.
But EA never looked at what we did while I was making it. So when I finished the game, I said, okay, here's the game. They looked at it and said, Steve, what did you do? This is a joke. This looks like a cartoon. Who's going to want to play this? He said, what difference?
Everybody.
You're gonna cancel the franchise anyway. So they shipped it, and it was so Lynx 386 was a better game, technically, better golf simulation, more accurate, better graphics. Everything about it was better, except our game was more fun. And so what happens? We quadrupled sales forecasts. And EA said, maybe we shouldn't cancel it after all. Okay, well, let's do one more.
Okay.
So,
and this was the next one. This was 98, PGA Tour Pro online.
So the internet comes out. And back then, the internet, we called it the information superhighway. But the internet was AOL. Remember AOL chat rooms? So I'm learning about the internet and I'm going into these AOL chat rooms. I go, I got it. Instead of seeing a list of people to chat with, what if I saw a list of people that wanted to play golf? And so I go to the engineers and said, I want to be on my computer and I want to play my friend down the street on his computer through the internet. And the engineer said, okay, yeah, you just type in his IP address. And no, that's too complicated. No, I just want to click a button. I want to see a list of names. And he goes, oh, well, if we did this thing like a match server that will gather information about everybody that wants to play, and then once you connect to them, we'll switch it to a game server that's sending information back and forth. And so we went out and bought a P200 from Fry's Electronics.
Oh, man.
It sat under my desk. That was EA.com. Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
And so we built the thing, and the darn thing worked.
Hold on. Hold on. So the entire online service for this was a P200 you bought off the shelf at one of the many amazing Fry's Electronics stores, right? I don't know if you went to the Egyptian themed one or the Western themed one, but like we always said, if there's a Fry's in town, you never have to ask where we are. We're not in the office. We're always at a Fry's, right? And so it was just running this live service under your desk.
Right.
So what I love about this, when I was at Sun Microsystems, I had founded javagaming.org back in 2001, which became the largest and still is the largest forum for Java game development, right, in the world. Mm-hmm. We went out to Fry's. We bought a machine. We didn't have it under the floor of our specific desk, but in our lab, we just basically punched a hole through the firewall, plugged this machine in, tucked it back in the corner, and just didn't tell anybody about it. And we ran the entire forum on that thing for like 5 years. It just ran. And I remember at one point there was problems with it. It wasn't, it was sluggish. It wasn't responding quickly. When I'd flown out, I found out that the fan on the CPU had fallen off. So the CPU was overheating. It was throttling down. So I just had to go in and kind of screw the fan back on, and then the forum was fine again. This is what we mean. Like, there were no rules for doing this. You just had to go get it done. And sometimes you have to push through the negativity and the no when we are right? When we know we are right. It's not about just the business. It is about the culture of games. It is about understanding how people play and the psychology of it. And so, thank goodness you did it, because that became the basis for Tiger Woods golf going forward, correct?
Right. Yeah, a year later, we added a tournament mode, and that became what may have been the world's first esports game.
Yeah.
Because you could play tournaments online.
Yeah.
And then a year later, Tiger Woods turns pro.
Right.
And he said, well, who's got the best golf game? Well, obviously EA Sports.
Yeah.
And so we signed
Amazing.
Tiger.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. We only have about 10 minutes left before we're going to start in a Q&A. So I'm going to kind of push us forward into your post-EA work, and then the work you did completely outside of games and how you came over here at AWS. So as we were talking before we brought everybody in, so you were at a company called Glue Mobile that started off as a company called Sorrent. And Sorrent was founded by Scott Orr. I forget the other co-founder, but Scott worked on the Madden franchise there at EA. And what we discovered is that at the time, I was supporting Sorrent at Sun Microsystems with all the Java games that you all were building. And I still have my Sorrent RC car that you had given away. And I believe Jen Herman was also working at Sorrent at the time. So that eventually became Glue Mobile. And you had a bunch of sports games that were done. Fox Sports Football, Track and Field, Yao Ming Basketball, Bush versus Kerry Boxing, and Deer Hunter. Tell me, what was it like working in a moment in time where we're moving from mid-P, to, or we were moving from WAP, rather, to mid-P 1.0. And for those that don't know, WAP was basically text-based information that could be displayed on mobile phones. Mid-P was really the first kind of framework. You could kind of think of it as multimedia framework 1.0 from Microsoft. It was the same thing for mobile. It's how are we going to display graphics? How will we do audio? How will we do key presses? As we moved into a world of mobile gaming, you were at the forefront of this as well. So tell us real quickly about your time at Glue Mobile and what it was like putting these properties together.
Well, I joined them. I was going to be a producer because I've been a producer at Electronic Arts. And I got there and we'd hired a team of programmers and they were used to working on the PlayStation or, and they said, wait a minute, this phone only has 64K of memory. You can't do anything in 64K of memory. It's impossible. I said, what do you mean? I used to make games in 4K.
Yes. I was a big 20 kid, right? We know.
Yeah. And so I go, fine. Okay, look, I'll show you how it's done. So I went out and I bought a book called Teach Yourself J2ME, which is the mobile version of Java. Yeah. Teach Yourself J2ME in 24 hours. So I read the book, came in and started programming. And by that afternoon, I had a display up on the screen of a basketball player shooting baskets. And everybody looked. I said, "What? How did you do that? That's impossible." I go, "No, you just write code like like it's assembly language, basically. You just use every little byte you can, and don't use the back then Java. I think had containers for objects. Yeah, even the fact that creating an object in software would there was a 500 byte overhead. Mm-hmm. So you had to throw away the concept of objects because that was using up too much memory. Yep. So everything was done in line code. Yes, I went back and programmed the first 6 games for Glue Mobile.
Yeah. Yeah, and they basically set the template for how we were going to build those types of experiences that others followed. And I love, again, the fact you went and picked up a book. I remember very early in my career, I convinced a local telephone company that I could write their customer management system in Paradox, right? Do all this Paradox scripting. Convinced, I was 19, I think, at the time. Convinced them I could do it. Went and got a book off the shelf at Soft Warehouse where I was working, which then became CompUSA. Learned Paradox scripting. Went home in between college classes at night. I just started writing their customer management system, just writing scripts in Paradox. So you just do what you gotta do, man, right? To get it done. So really incredible. So you were at Glue for a while, till about 2004 or 5. And then you went off and you were working with actually John Romero at Gazillion, who we just interviewed on the previous episode of Game Industry Legends. And you worked on a project called Redwood, which hadn't been released. Can you tell us briefly about that project?
Yes. So the concept was a combination of World of Warcraft, which was the biggest online game at the time, and Mario Brothers. So to make a World of Warcraft for kids. And the secret sauce is that you would encounter these puzzles within this 3D world, this giant online world. And the 3D puzzles all had a stealth learning component to them. In other words, a kid would walk up and maybe there was a door with a lock and some gears, and you had to spin the gears to open the lock. Well, what you didn't realize is that you were learning about gear ratios. And so there was this element of learning that gave validity to the game. We had a whole board of educators working with us. And massive online world. And we did the first version. It looked gorgeous. I mean, it looked like the movie Avatar years before the movie Avatar came out. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful. And as we're getting ready to go into full production, this little game comes out called Farmville. And all of a sudden, the world the marketplace stopped caring about huge online worlds and only cared about tiny little plots of land on their screen.
Yeah.
And the market for huge online worlds disappeared overnight.
Yeah.
And so that led to the collapse of Gazillion.
But then that led to your next project, which was Zoo World 2, which was a sequel to a Facebook game, but it was the largest Facebook game at the time ever done. So
I mean, we had something like a chip with something like 80 different animals. It's huge, and they were all done in 3D instead of hand drawn. Again, going back to trying to make the best graphics we could, and it became the first Facebook game sequel. as well.
Incredible. All right. So, Steve, so you leave the game space and you start focusing, you're taking all of your, the inspired, approach to design and looking at usability. And in 2015, you designed a cloud-based real-time collaboration service called Bluescape. Now,
Right.
this again is, well before we're seeing things, the common tools that people use that are kind of web-based and online collaborative tools. How did this come about? How did you decide to leave games and start focusing on, a collaborative web-based tool that also integrated video and audio conferencing? Like, tell us about your experience with Bluescape.
Well, a VP that I'd worked with earlier in the games business, she called me up and said, "Hey, I just joined an enterprise startup, and I want you to take a look at what we have." So I went up there, and all they had was a large touch screen that you could draw on. It was actually, the parent company was a furniture company of all things. They were trying to develop a tool that would allow them to do office space layout. So I looked at this giant touch screen, but it was in the cloud. And I go, what's the cloud? It's in 2015, nobody can do. I go, wait a minute, you mean if I'm on this screen and there's somebody else with a similar screen in another city, they can see what I'm drawing as I draw it? And then it's persistent, and then it scrolls, you can scroll it, and it's endless. I go, this is the ultimate design tool.
Yeah.
I mean, before that, you in a room on a drawing on a whiteboard, and when you finish the meeting, you write "do not erase" in the corner of the whiteboard.
Right.
All of a sudden, or take a picture of what's on the whiteboard and pass it around. All that goes away. This is the ultimate design tool, because whatever you drew on this large touch screen, you go back to your desk, and there it was on your computer.
Amazing.
Because it was in the cloud. I go, this is the ultimate design tool. Forget about laying out furniture.
Yeah.
So, and then look, we'll pop up these video windows so you can actually see and talk to the person you're collaborating with. And we'll let you organize. So the whole thing came to me in like 2 minutes. And so that became Bluescape. Now, I think actually Amazon licenses a really reduced version of Bluescape. But sadly, if you look at Bluescape today, I'm not sure it's held up. I mean, it's basically what you see today is basically what I designed 8 years ago. So
Amazing.
I don't know that it actually kept up with it.
But it's also where companies like Canva and stuff have cribbed design elements from Bluescape.
Well, I think one of our first customers was Lucasfilm, and they ended up using it to storyboard the last 3 Star Wars films.
Incredible.
That was pretty cool.
That is really cool. That's pretty amazing, actually. Yeah, and we've actually used Bluescape here at AWS. We had one remote event, and we wound up using Bluescape as well, right? So it still is available, and it still works. Like, why not continue using it? I still know people that still use Paint Shop because they're like, it just works. Like, I know how to use it. It's got everything that I need, right? No need to move on. So all right. So you built Bluescape. We can all try that out here. And then in 2017, you joined this group called Nimble Collective, which was a pivot from the work that you were doing in Bluescape to cloud animation. So tell us about Nimble Collective and then how you came into AWS through that work.
Nimble Collective has been started by some founders from Pixar and DreamWorks. Now, these weren't just any guys. I mean, like our CEO was one of the lead animators on Toy Story. Another founder was one of the guys that developed the software that Pixar uses. A third founder was the lead animator on Lord of the Rings. I mean, these were Academy Award-winning artists and designers. So their idea was to move movie production from on-premise to in the cloud. And they took a look at my background. So I've done work in entertainment, video games, and also work in enterprise. So I would come in and build up a UX team. And it was about a 30-person startup. And I think as the day after I joined, the funding fell through. So I ended up being the UX team. So after about 2 years, we developed this service And the movie studio said, this is amazing. Everybody's going to be doing their movie production in the cloud someday, but not today, maybe in about 5 years. So, well, we were a small startup. We couldn't wait.
Yeah.
But Amazon came along and said, well, we can afford to wait. So Amazon ended up buying us. And so that's how I came to Amazon.
Amazing. So then tell us about the work that you're doing here right now at AWS.
Well, I continued as a designer. We were the same 30% startup. It just Amazon was paying the bills. And eventually the team grew and our organization grew and ended up managing a team of 6 designers. I think some of them on the call today, some really amazingly talented people. And so the latest project is moving. Well, I guess I shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah. We won't talk about our the projects that we're undergoing, but I mean, we are incredibly fortunate to have you here, Steve. And I think thank you. Well, first for sharing your this condensed version of an incredibly prolific career and one that has had impact far beyond just the creations that you made, whether it was creating new techniques for creating games or design or interface. Those games have inspired generations of game developers, generations of experiential programmers. And again, it's one of the reasons why back when we were doing the art of video games, I'm like, man, this guy created one of my favorite games of all time. How can we not have him, as part of this? And clearly, your impact has rippled right throughout your entire career into the games industry. Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me and our audience today here on Game Industry Legends. It has been an absolute privilege and look forward to working with you here at AWS.
Been fun.